In this section, we'll look at the growth in sports in the 1920s and also the new celebrity culture that began to develop. Certainly, the 1920s was sort of the golden age for professional baseball. In 1922, Supreme Court held with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes writing for the majority that baseball was a sport, not a business, and thus exempt from antitrust legislation. The suit had been filed by the Federalist League, challenging the supremacy of the American and National Leagues, the two established leagues. There were famous baseball players, for example, Babe Ruth, shown here, who hit 60 home runs for the New York Yankees in 1927. There's also people like Ty Cobb, the Detroit Tigers manager, whose earlier record of 4,191 major league hits stood for many years. Baseball's growth came on the heels of the disaster of the 1919 Black Sox scandal, in which 8 Chicago White Sox players took bribes in exchange for throwing the World Series of 1919. This was famously shown in the Kevin Costner 1987 movie, The Field of Dreams. College football, which had its roots in rugby in the late 19th century, exploded in the 1920s. College football produced new stars like the Illinois halfback Red Grange, who later went on to professional football, a Pro Bowl, and for the St. Louis Rams. Colleges formed leagues, and then they began to argue which league was best. And of course, there was money to be made in answering that question, and so they made bowl games where the champions of various leagues would play each other at the end of the season, and they would invariably get a lot of people to come, and so they built these massive stadiums that looked from the sky, and again they were planes, but they looked from the sky as being like a gigantic bowl. And this bowl games, here you see them, the 1926 Rose Bowl shown here. Of course, football in college was a money-making endeavor for those colleges, and so you begin to see the consumerism and marketing advertising of college football. Here we see a staged publicity photo. The four horsemen of the apocalypse is what they call the four very prolific backs of Notre Dame. They strike fear in every defense. The four horsemen of the apocalypse and the victorious teams of Notre Dame helped make famous their coach, Newt Rockne. Boxing grew in popularity. There were famous fights in 1926 and 1927 between Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney, which attracted more than 2,000 people and was broadcast to thousands by radio. When Tunney won the 1927 bout thanks to a famous long count by a referee, 5 radio listeners dropped dead of heart attacks. Challenging the stereotype of women as frail and helpless was Gertrude Ederle, who became famous as the first woman to swim the 24 miles of the English Channel. Obviously, it was still a man's world, however. In 1921, a businessman in Atlantic City, New Jersey, had a struggling hotel and figured out a way to promote his resort was to have a so-called Miss America pageant. He would get women from different states to come to a pageant where men, customers in his hotel, could vote on who was the prettiest. Perhaps one of the greatest media events of the 1920s was the first solo Atlantic crossing of the airplane by an unknown young flyer named Charles Lindbergh. He was perfect for the media. He was handsome, tall, and thin. He'd spent his 20s as sort of a barnstormer, a stunt flyer, and then an airmail pilot. And he decided to compete for a $25,000 prize offered by a New York hotel owner for the first nonstop flight from New York to Paris. And so on May 20th to 21st, Lindbergh's plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, left Roosevelt Field on Long Island and touched down in Paris. There, thousands greeting him. The crowd was described by one journalist as a, quote, surging ocean of people. Lindbergh's, fame led to a New York City ticker tape parade, and he was even allowed to go to the White House to meet President Coolidge. Sadly, however, Lindbergh's fame also led to his child being kidnapped and later discovered dead. It was the Lindbergh baby trial, and they convicted Bruno Hauptmann of killing Lindbergh's baby. I guess, being in front of the public is got a downside to it. With the new media sort of producing a celebrity culture, you see the public following high profile media driven trials, almost like sports. Sort of the case today. The case in the 1920s of Leopold and Loeb was probably the most famous. Leopold and Loeb were convicted of bludgeoning to death a 14-year-old boy in Chicago on May 22nd, 1924. It turns out that Leopold and Loeb were two brilliant, wealthy kids who did the crime to prove to themselves that they could commit the perfect crime and sort of to test their personal toughness and stress under pressure. Leopold was 19 years old and was the son of a vice president of Sears Roebuck. He was the youngest person ever to graduate from the University of Chicago. Loeb, who was 18, had already graduated from the University of Michigan. The two hired the famous lawyer Clarence Darrow to defend them, and actually Darrow was convinced the judge that they were mentally ill, and thus they actually avoided execution. They still were sentenced to tough sentences. They both were sentenced to life plus 99 years. Loeb was killed in a fight in 1936, and Leopold was finally paroled in 1958. This concludes the section on the sports and celebrity culture.